Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to one of these artist talks with myself, Sam Gregory, and I'm very happy to welcome along Joe Cornish. Joe, hello.
Hello, Sam. Good to see you.
You too.
Hi, Joe.
Hi,
And
Tim.
we have Tim with us from Fotospeed, our technical wizard. I'm going to get him a little wizard's hat or something. We need to denote somehow how much of a wizard he is, because it's dark arts that surprise me all the time. But obviously, we're here to talk to Joe about his photography. And actually, like with many of these talks, we're going to pick out a selection of Joe's images and sort of walk through them and get some of the background behind the shots, some of the considerations with the locale, or maybe the stories or deeper meanings behind it, and then maybe some thoughts about printing more widely and specifically to those particular images, because we've got a few here which are going to have specific points that you might want to consider or to be mindful of when you're printing images of these types anyway. So that will be the format, and we'll get into those images any minute. But just as a quick question before we get into the images, Joe, obviously we're all starting to get back out now, but I think potentially you will have enjoyed exploring locally as you have done for many years over the last 12 months. Is that fair to say you've really enjoyed actually having that time to get out more and more?
It is, and I feel slightly guilty about having really enjoyed having a year off. It's been great. I do think there's probably quite a few of us who feel the same way. I mean, obviously, it's been a bit of a blow not having any income or much income to speak of, but actually that doesn't really matter. You can live on very little, and I've found that walking in the local woods, especially, has genuinely has been a fantastic solace and rest. And I've actually done a lot more exercise. Strangely, it might sound odd to say that, but I'm probably fitter now than I was certainly this time last year. And that's something I'm very grateful for. And I know the local woods particularly, but the moors as well, even better than I did before, thanks to not having anything to do.
Yeah, well, you did your best in the situation. As someone who's trailed behind Joe whilst he's walking at speed, the fact that you're even fitter now fills me with dread, but we won't go into that any further. I like to tease him about that. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, let's dive into it, because I really think, Joe, it's always great to talk to you about your images and the wider thoughts behind composition, location, importance of location, not just from a scouting, but from a much more fundamental point of view to how we can represent images in different ways and their natural situation. So I wanted to start in kind of a wintry scene here. And obviously, depending on how people are viewing this on the size of the screen you're looking at, there is a visitor in this image, which I would say is potentially quite rare for you, Joe, but not at all out of line with your general concepts to do with nature and habitat and representing things in their natural way as they are now, perhaps. So tell us a little bit, if you can, about the background of this image, and then we'll get into maybe some of the specifics.
Yeah, well, I think that's quite true. I think the ethos is totally consistent, but I suppose I always used to feel that as a large format photographer, I would never get any pictures with animals in, because they'd always have gone by the time I'd got round to focusing and calculating my exposures and so on. But the funny thing about that sort of slow contemplative approach is that there are times when you are set up with your camera and an animal will walk into it. And as you know, Sam, the UK, is not the best place for wildlife photography, for the obvious reason that most wildlife are quite rightly terrified of human beings because we kill them, or pursue them, hunt them, and so on. So actually, an encounter with a truly wild animal like a deer, although they're not that unusual, certainly not unusual in Scotland, it is still a bit special. And it's a lovely thing to experience. So I was actually making this composition with, just because I was so intrigued by the way the boulders had all covered up with snow, and created this lovely kind of framing of the stream, which has disappeared. And then the kind of slightly random note of the plantation top right is a very sort of Scottish feature, you could say. There's a lot of planted woodland in Scotland, some of it very, very new plantation. But trees are you know, a great subject when snow falls on them anyway. And then and it really was quite fabulous to have the deer, the stag, appear, because it does create a nice balance to the trees, which are a kind of unbalancing element. And you know, there's that feeling of watcher being watched and vice versa. So that's the kind of background to the image, if you will, and a very flat light, which I love. And it's in a part of the world that's popular with photographers, but it's of nothing in particular, which is also something that appeals to me.
Yeah, ditto. I'm very much a nowhere in particular sort of a fan. But I think, can I just pick up on one point, Joe, just from a balance point of view? You mentioned obviously the trees up in the far right, and there's two things I want to say. You always get that very hard edge, don't you, when they're sort of plantation style, but it's just tonally they're obviously darker, they're heavier, and I think you were alluding to the stag sort of counterpointing that. Did you mean in that sort of tonal presence the fact that you then have, or just from physical aspects as well?
I'd say it's more of a narrative balance. And clearly, if you look at the trees, they occupy, well, let's say sort of 15% of the image area, might be a bit more even, whereas the stag is, you know, 1% perhaps. So it can't compete in that sense. But I think that the way that human beings, I mean, certainly I, are looking at it as a, you know, I find my eye drawn to the stag, but there's a kind of oscillation between them. And the stag, the way it's positioned, it's right at the, you know, there's an approximate energy line where the stream sort of flows down the hill, and you know, it leads to or from the stag, if you will. So, and there's even, I'm not sure the resolution everybody's going to see this at, but there's beyond on the mountainside beyond, there's even a little shape that kind of fits rather nicely in, as it happens with the shape of the stag's antlers. So, or at least there's a relationship there. So there's a number of subtle things going on which are pure luck. You know, it's just down to where
the stag stopped.
Yeah, where the picture was. You know, I'd made 2 or 3 exposures probably. I'm not absolutely sure. It did move around and then it moved off. So there's not many, and I just inevitably, as you do when you're in a situation like this, to print, you select the one that you feel works best. So it's not a kind of high emotion moment like some extraordinary wildlife photo. It's incidental wildlife, and as a matter of interest, I've taken or made many pictures of this kind in recent years when I've been traveling in the polar regions, where I've been very, very fortunate to be in places where there is more wildlife and where they're not necessarily quite so scared of human beings as they are in the UK.
You mentioned there about the the sort of emotional impact of it, but I know how you will have felt for those few seconds when you're both aware of each other, and that's a special thing, isn't it? That's part of why we do what we do, for those little moments that will only ever necessarily be with you, both at the time and in the image, but we feel some of that because of this gaze. And I suppose that is when you do have a wildlife or a person, if you're traveling and you have that connection. I suppose our job is to try and then portray some of that through the frame that we felt at the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think human beings are I mean, our connection with animals is it's kind of weird these days, you know, in the modern world, but it's incredibly deep. You know, it evolved through, you know, millions of years of evolution, and I think we feel a connection, and whether we can articulate it or not it's a very complex and ambiguous relationship, isn't it, with animals? So we've subordinated them to us, and yet we still have a great sense of wonder for wild animals, especially ones that are bigger and stronger than we are. And of course we have this very, very close relationship with our domestic, you know, beloved domestic animals, and all of which, you know, makes a complex brew in that sense. And I think, you know, we see an animal that could kill us or hurt us, and we see it in the wild, and we have a safe encounter with it. It's an incredible high. It really is. So, I mean, in the case of a stag, perhaps it could do a lot of damage. And one doesn't tend to feel at risk from a large deer, because generally they are so frightened of us and not likely to represent a clear and present danger. But that in terms of the emotion, that still remains very strong. And it's part of the magic of having an encounter like this. Yeah, definitely.
Joe, can we just talk from a little bit of a printing sort of and technical point of view? Because I think in this image in particular, you know, it's the kind of thing that you need to be quite careful with potentially printing and preparing to print, and then what you print it on is a different conversation as well. But so on a sort of more wider point, with reference to this image, perhaps, if you will, are there particular things you bear in mind specifically when you're dealing with snow and these sorts of images, and how you then realize them out onto the print?
Yeah, it's a really good example in that sense. I mean, in that, I mean, any snow picture is challenging, and snow in flat light in particular is challenging. The first thing, I suppose, the two great considerations are, one is white balance, because, you know, let's say, I mean, it really, really does depend on how you want to translate it. But generally speaking, you do need some blue in the image. If you were to take, let's say, your pipette and take even a bright white from the scene with your white balance pipette, it would come out looking very warm. And it wouldn't be warm; it'd be neutral, but it would look strange in this kind of lighting. So lighting, somewhere behind all that cloud is blue sky, and that blue cast is actually the prevailing color scheme. And if you move too far away from that, then it'll look quite unnatural. So the white balance needs to be cool, not so cold that it becomes an obvious cast, but there's that's a critical. It is critical from my point of view, because I don't want it to announce itself. I mean, if you want to create a strong stylistic approach, that's different. You know, that can be done, but it wouldn't be my choice. And then the other thing is that snow, if you're mindful to avoid clipping, which most photographers and most printers certainly are, and it's very understandably so, snow provides a very special challenge, because you kind of think, oh well, you're keeping the numbers. If you think of the RGB numbers that you use, look out for the brightest point, and let's say in this case that would be on the mountain slopes in the distance. If you have something below 250 in all RGB numbers, then it's quite likely the snow will come out muddy looking. You have to kind of be quite brave and go and maybe even clip a channel, in my experience. Otherwise the snow will tend to look quite muddy. So keeping it bright, really bright, but still keeping a dot in those very bright highlights. I mean, that's sounding a bit technical, but I'm not the most technical printer by any stretch, but that's where the art of printing snow is. At the same time, if you look at the boulders in the foreground, that area I've actually increased the contrast, the tonal contrast. It may not look like it, because it shouldn't. It should look just right. But in order to make it work as a print, I'm not sure if this file is a print file, by the way, but to make it, when I have printed this image, to make it work, I've actually had to increase the contrast in the highlights. So obviously that means taking the tones that are a little bit below bright white and darkening them to increase the tonal contrast and to therefore increase the presence, so that the boulders actually occupy the imagination in the way that I felt they affect, or I want them to affect me when I'm viewing the image. And I do, it's about how I respond to it. I've got no idea how other people respond to my work. I don't really try to worry about that. So I don't think about an audience, but what I'm trying to do is essentially please myself. I'm a very selfish printer.
Well, that's the thing that should always be the first goal, shouldn't it?
I think so.
Tim, just from the point of view of paper types, maybe, and white points on paper and paper bases with regards to snow. Now, I know, Joe, we'll loop back to you maybe, Joe, used to use the smooth cotton and now using the platinum cotton. and I know different paper types will require different considerations when printing. But Tim, from your point of view, with these sorts of snowy images, is there anything else you'd like to add to that from the paper end?
No, I think Joe's kind of said it all, really. I'm really interested to know, or just to hear that you allow for the white balance. Is that with the it's something I've done in the past as well, especially with snow and things, to put a little bit of blue. Is that just to allow for the warmness of the paper? Because even if it's a bright white paper, it's never white, is it? There's always it's more of a neutral white, isn't it? The paper type, and especially with platinum cotton as well, because that is a little bit on the warmer side.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Tim, just sort of talking over you there, but I think, no, just it is clearly different papers with their different bases. I mean, a paper like platinum cotton has quite an ivory base, but it's still a lovely paper to print a snow picture on. I don't think it is that. I actually think it's to do with the ambient light. And the white balance I'm talking about is probably at the raw conversion stage. I mean, clearly, for me, and I know for many photographers, we tend to work in a two-stage process. So in the raw converter, you do what you might call the heavy lifting, 80-90% of the tonal, local adjustments, and white balance, and all that. And then in Photoshop, I still print from Photoshop partly because for very fine, small little bits of retouching, that is the best environment still. And because I've always printed from Photoshop, so there's a kind of if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. And Photoshop still has some very, very cool and unique color editing tools that work particularly well for landscape photography, as it happens. And so that's why I use it in that way. But I would say that in terms of setting the tone, if we use that in a kind of metaphoric sense, I do all of that in the raw converter. So when I say the white balance, what I'm talking about is I think it's called the tone slider. If you think of Lightroom or Camera Raw, which is blue to yellow. So if you were to just repeat that point, if you were to take the white balance pipette, and let's say it came out at 5500, for example, I would probably take it down a bit. 52, 51, or these are crude terms, but 5100, which would make it look a bit colder.
Okay.
Yeah, and it may depend obviously on the image and whatnot, as we've said. But good. Okay, look, I'm conscious of we've got so many great images that I really want to get into. Joe and I could kill about 8 hours easily, probably on one. But I'll try not to drag you into that, Joe. But Tim, if you want to bring us on to our next image, because we've still got this kind of cold theme, if we will. But interestingly, many other color things to consider here, and we do find with these sorts of situations, obviously there's lots of graphical things we could discuss here as well. But if we just kind of carry on from where we were, you do get this sort of rainbow effect of color sometimes reflecting in these ice patterns. So that's another thing, isn't it, Joe, just to be really careful of in the edit stage. But so maybe we'll get into that. And then if you can sort of just tell us about why you settled on this spot and the image making process itself.
There's a couple of points, Sam. But you brought up the rainbowing, and that's a really interesting dilemma, I think, for me, because that came about as a result of using a polarizer. I don't know if you've done that with ice details, but using a polarizer is an incredibly interesting way of photographing ice details, because you get completely different results as you spin the polarizer around, because of the nature of, a physicist would no doubt be able to tell us why, but there's all those different planes and surfaces in the ice, which specular reflect the sun's rays if it's a sunny day, which it was here, and you get these sort of splitting. It's a phase change. And of course, you can get rid of that color by desaturating it completely, or desaturating magenta and green, in this case, to get a neutral effect. But I kind of quite like the color, so I just left it in as it happens. And I might have desaturated a little bit, but essentially those color casts that you're describing are still there, and I don't find them difficult, actually. But I mean, if you did, you could desaturate that image, and let's say if you wanted to create a bit more coloring, you could use a split tone. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways of considering how, do you want to retain the color detail? A lot of people will probably say it's better as a monochrome, but I love color photography, and I love color, as an inherent part of, the physical experience of being outdoors. So my preference is always to use the color that there is, and as it happens, the color here is partly the byproduct of a polarizer. So.
If we talk about can we talk about rhythm a little bit, Joe? Because sometimes in these places, and it can be similar if you're in tidal locations and beaches where you've got beautiful rock formations, basically anywhere where you and I could spend many hours staring down at our feet and toying with shape and rhythm and energy. But the challenge is always knowing how much to have in, as it always is, I suppose, how close to get, how close not to get. Sometimes we can suffocate some of these shapes. And I know that, I suppose, rhythm generally is the aim a lot of the time, isn't it, with these? How do you it happens on an individual basis, I understand, but in this particular image, what were you potentially mindful of to make sure that there was enough space for it to flow, yet not so much that we can't follow that flow, if that makes sense?
Well, yeah, the making pictures like this is the ultimate kind of creative decision-making process in a way, because you are completely responsible for the edge of the frame. There's some, you think some other kinds of photography, it's fairly obvious, but here it isn't at all obvious. I mean, you can't actually, the viewer can't see beyond the edge of the frame here, but it pretty rapidly runs out into a muddy track. So it is literally a frozen puddle, and it's so it's an abstraction in that sense from reality. It's a sort of piece you could even argue it's a piece of escapism, but I would argue that it's simply an observation of the beauty of ice. And in terms of what are you referencing, I mean, I always use the word rhythm, Sam, and that's a good one because it links us immediately to music. And any musician, when they're either whether playing or composing, they're always having, how much do I put in, the phrasing and the sequencing of the notes and the weight and the color. All of these things are the same as they are in photography. And the kind of, in many ways, an abstraction is like a piece of jazz music. I think you're working with elements that are slightly out of control, that you can't necessarily fully control, but you're trying to establish what I think of as a web of relationships, that work. There is a unifying theme, which is one of the figure. So if I can use that in the most loose sense possible, but you could see many, you might be able to see many different themes or objects in the way that the patterns here unfold. And I don't want to say what they are, because I don't think, in a way, I don't want to constrain the interpretation of that picture. But in a way, it's hard to avoid the impression that stone top center is a kind of focus or a head or a focal point. It could be. And so all the other forms, which are fluid, have sort of somewhat marine quality, or or wings, or what, they could mean anything. But and they're crisscrossed by these wonderful kind of semi-opaque pieces of geometry, which is one of the stress patterns in the ice. The ice is incredibly complex. I mean, this file, it's 150 megapixel original camera file. It's made with a technical camera and a very high quality standard lens. So I've been able to place the plane of focus exactly on the plane of the subject. So you can zoom into it, and there's just little worlds within worlds of detail inside that image. So you print it as large as you like, and you could eyeball it and find pictures within pictures, which for me is part of the joy of photography. But also with something like this, just to refer back to your original point, you're trying how, I looked at it much tighter. I looked at it a little bit wider, and the more I went in, the more difficult I found it to make a coherent statement. So in the end, my final framing, backed off, not perfect. It's not about perfection. Is managing these almost kind of conflicting lines and relationships that converse across the picture space, and I think that's all you can do is come up with it's a tussle, it's a battle, there's tension at these competing energy flows, and that's part of the fun of it. But there is also this sort of figure from an aesthetic point of view. There's the figure theme, and
we're gonna, I think, well, I know, because I want to touch on it later with another one of the images with that figure theme as well, because it's something that does come up in your work in various ways. So I think just Tim, I think if we go on maybe one just again.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think this almost asks for, I don't know, for me anyway, it kind of echoes kind of that Art Deco feel in it as well. I don't know if you've ever thought of that, Joe. I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking on another wavelength. But
no, I think
it's that figure, isn't it? Like you say, it's that flow. And
well, Art Deco is that's a really interesting reference, because if you think about, I mean, not a great art historian, but my understanding of Art Deco is there's a tremendous amount of natural forms referenced in Art Deco. It's very, we think of it as being decorative, but actually it is the ethos of Art Deco is it's drawn from nature. So you could think of all the many abstractions that there are in nature that are very organic in that sense. So the organic patterning in Art Deco is, you can pick up a reference here for sure.
Yeah. Cool. Right. Let's move on.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think you talked about competing energy flows, perhaps. Flows, that's a topical word. Didn't necessarily mean to use that here, but it does make sense. But that obviously transcends up and scales up to the larger frames, doesn't it? And the larger landscape within it. And suddenly things which can be hundreds of meters or half a mile wide become still a single flow or a single energy line across the frame. So maybe we can expand on that a little bit here. But I think before we get into that, Joe, I don't know exactly where this was, but I've got a good idea. And you've travelled in this area a fair amount, I believe, or not. But these, okay.
I wish I had. I mean, it's actually. So I'd love to say it's Greenland. It's eastern Greenland, and it is a very. It's actually rarely visited because it's so difficult to get to. So it's an extraordinary privilege to be able to do so, and I am very mindful of that, and I'm anxious about the carbon footprint and all of that. But I also feel a kind of a responsibility to try to convey the beauty of places like this, and also their fragility and vulnerability as we move forward in this era of changing climate in particular.
But I know you're a seeker of wilderness, and that's a difficult word now because everybody throws their own thoughts about it at it. But I know that the experiences you had when you're an even younger man emphasize that importance of you, and the feeling you had there about the harmony of nature and our position within it. And so with these images now, is the goal, as you've alluded to there, to remind, or what can we do with that? What is the power of the photography to bring that to bear?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very, very difficult one. I think landscape photography, by its very nature, well, for me, it's an eyewitness process, and you can't. And also, for it to communicate, it has to be it has to be able to convey connection and a feeling of beauty for me, because without that, that beauty creates that beauty and connection and kind of emotional depth are all deeply linked. They're not separate, and sometimes there can be other sentiments that the photographer might feel at the time, but if you can't create connection, then ultimately your work won't have any significance. And it's difficult because you're not going and photographing a war or animals being being tortured or something really, really obviously emotive in that way. You're photographing scenery, and to an extent, if you're using it as a means of communication, what is the story? That's the question you probably do have to ask yourself. I mean, for me, the process itself is a kind of a kind of search for connection, and so pointing the camera at the landscape is a very personal one. What happens afterwards is something I talk about, write about, and we have these lovely conversations. But I can't obligate or force anybody to change their behavior as a result of seeing my pictures. Nice that might be, but what I want to do is to be part of, if you will, a movement for change, for restoring our broken relationship with the natural world. And I think that comes through on many, many levels with there's huge amount of work being done on it by multiple agencies, individuals, organizations these days. And I think in the photographic community, we do have a role to play, because we're the kind of visual pioneers of human society. And our job is to go out and see what there is out there, and to bring back stories and to talk about them as well as our pictures. So at somewhere like Greenland, there is the rate of ice melt is just immense at the moment, which is inexorably part of the kind of rising sea level issue that we will, and future generations will have to face. But it's also a fantastically beautiful place with still a lot of wildlife and the fascinating flora, which is obviously going to have to change probably with rising temperatures. And these coastal regions will be very, very vulnerable as well to increases in temperature. I mean, the ice that you see here, this is not as if Greenland is suddenly going to become ice-free. I mean, let's be clear, there's gazillions of tons of ice still on Greenland. It's the second biggest ice cap on planet Earth after Antarctica. And it will take probably at least a 4-figure sum of years to get rid of all that ice, and that won't happen. I don't think, because I think human beings, whatever we've done between now and then, we're going to be reducing our carbon footprint. I'm pretty confident about that. The question is how much ice perhaps will be lost, and whether it will remain as coastal, because at the moment there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of glaciers that are tidewater glaciers in Greenland. Now, there will come a point where they will retreat where they no longer generate these amazing ice sculptures into the ocean if climate change continues. And that it's largely driven by warming water, by the way, not warming air temperatures. So it's the earth sciences of it are quite complex. So future generations will certainly still be able to see icebergs. The question is whether they will feel they can actually go there any longer because of the carbon footprint. So, and also what we're looking at now, this particular, if you look into the background, you can see there's 2 massive glaciated valleys either side of that mountain. Well, not that long ago, there were glaciers coming down to the sea there. And these icebergs have actually come from elsewhere, from a glacier a little bit up the coast, about 4 miles up the coast. So they're not generated down in this bay. They just arrived here through the force of ocean currents. But I mean, what an amazing place! I mean, and we were so fortunate to be there. And by the way, I've talked too much, but I mean, just purely from a photographic point of view, shot from a Zodiac, so handheld, lots of challenges in that. And even though it's so calm, you'd think that you'd be able to put the boat on a spot and leave it there. That's never how it works. They're in constant motion. So the hardest part for me was, how do I compose something that makes sense? And you can see where I'm going here with this, sort of trying to as it were, move, put myself in a position where the ice frames the reflection of the mountain, and still makes sense, given that it's intruding into the reflection on the right hand side in a way that's a little bit eye catching, and you're having to do it split seconds, and you've got other people around you who also deserve every much right to be making pictures as you have. So you're and also as the kind of photographic leader, I'm trying to sort of gently ask the Zodiac driver to give us a little bit of go back a bit, forward a bit, and so on. So it's a pretty complicated process, but I was reasonably happy with this picture, honestly.
Well, I think it's difficult, isn't it, Joe? Because when there's so many wider topics at play, sometimes it can feel like the dissection of an image is the least important. However, I think the images have to carry a certain power, and the way they do that is because of the visual language and coordination that's used within them. So how it is constructed and the great lengths that we go to as photographers to frame things in a way that our brains and eyes react to and understand is ordered, carries that message, which would be much broader and wider in its way. So it is still important to understand how images quote unquote work or so forth, but I know that is sometimes difficult. So just to finish kind of on this one, I just wanted to say, really, for me, it's kind of a triumph of interconnecting elements. We have our ups, our downs, lots of little triangles and lines just crossing over everywhere, and that sometimes is what helps bring that order and where the reflection is, as you say, every part of the frame. And that's something you've been a master of for many years. But having also stood on the edge of a bobbing Zodiac, I absolutely get how that could have been a difficult one to deal with. So I think because we've got some other images we want to get through, we won't necessarily talk about the print on this, because I think there's a couple of other things, unless, Joe, you had something specific you thought was relevant to consider or pertinent with printing on this particular image. It feels just to me like it could be very big, happily, and it would suit being very big because of the grandeur of the scene.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Well, I think it does work at any scale. For me, I think obviously the bigger you print, the more you can look into images. One thing that this is more of a camera thing rather than a printing thing, because it's a relatively straightforward image to print. Once you take into account the making, having the ice have presence, the ice in the foreground has a little additional clarity to help make it look and feel more like ice. But yeah, just the camera thing that many would perhaps be surprised by is it was shot at f8, and if you with a 24mm lens, admittedly, but if this focus point is the foreground where the ice is, and yet the detail in the background is absolutely perfectly adequate in a big print. So I'm pointing that out partly because I think so many people get very hung up on depth of field with landscape photography, thinking they've got to stop down a long way or use hyperfocal focusing. Basically, I keep things very simple. I generally try not to stop down beyond 11 because of diffraction being, generally a bad thing. And let's not go into that now because that's a whole other issue.
That's another day.
Yeah, exactly. But I think in terms of depth of field, at f8, it's perfectly adequate.
Okay, great. Let's move on, because we're going from one part of the world to another, which is not far from me right now, where I am, in fact, because we're in Dorset here. I know this location, and I know you've visited many times, and I think I want to just let you talk about it really. But whenever we're at the sea, wherever it might be, in Hawaii to Dorset and everywhere in between, there's always there's an energy, isn't there? And I suppose one of the battles we have as still photographers is to impart that sense of energy, along with obviously light and everything else that contributes to it. But maybe just inform us a little, Joe, about here and I suppose selecting the moment, isn't it, and understanding how we pass that energy over through the frame.
Yeah, that is the. I mean, I think if I look back to over 40 years ago, I had my degree show, and that actually was the underlying theme of all my coastal photography in that degree show, was the idea of conveying energy. So in some ways, I haven't really moved on at all for over 40 years, but I think it's a worthwhile theme simply because I think physicists would probably tell us that everything's energy, on a kind of subatomic and on a cosmic scale, and so there's a metaphoric kind of concern for that. But I mean, our experience is so, as human beings, is so richly filtered by the limitations of the scale of our own existence, and yet we find so much that can convey that some of those sort of microscopic and cosmic metaphors in the landscape. Not to overplay it on this particular image, because you could say there isn't. It's quite a normal pictorial structure, really. But I think what I like about it, and what I think has been successful looking at it now at the distance of a year or so since I shot it, is that the shelved rock, you can pick it up both in the far distant headland, in the immediate foreground, and in the shape of that sea stack, which is a remnant of that shelved. Basically, these are sedimentary layers that have been metamorphosed over time and uplifted and so on. And they're still being attacked by forces of erosion today, which is very evident in the power of the sea as it's breaking over the waves, which again is reflected in the storm, retreating storm clouds in the distance. So kind of it's a bit of a kitchen sink energy picture, if you will. So it's had everything thrown at it in a way. Although, having said that, it's got blue sky, which is a bit boring. But I mean, you have to accept there are some limitations. On the other hand, the blue of the sky probably and the bright sunlight does create that slightly weird, but I think entirely understandable luminous green as the sun breaks through with the medium length exposure. I mean, it's probably a second. I think it's probably a 4-stop standard filter. It might be 6, but I think it's probably a 4-stop standard filter, and it's either half a second or 1 second. I think it's probably 1 second, but that's deliberate. Clearly, I mean, you could, in a bright sunny day, you could have shot it at 60th, 125th or something, and got more detail, but of the water. But I actually have always favoured shutter speeds that convey motion, a sense of motion, while retaining structure.
Yeah, it's always a balance, isn't it? Tim, did you want to jump in on any thoughts here? I can sense you've got...
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask Joe really about how because I'm kind of getting, especially with the last image and in this one as well, really, that the sense of something that doesn't quite fit, perhaps not in a photographic way, but in kind of an uncanny way. Like there's something, there's a sense that a bit with the ice, it was almost like, because the ice has disappeared, it's almost not, it shouldn't be part of that scene anymore. I don't know if you've thought about that. It was just kind of this sense. I just keep thinking about the idea of the uncanny and things going on the photographs. And it was interesting you said about the sky and the rocks and that green that was coming as well. So it's kind of that feeling in yourself that it's just something's just, it's not a bad thing. I don't, not kind of composition or anything like that. They're so fabulous pictures, but it's just kind of, as a viewer, you kind of get that thing that just puts you a little bit off. And I think that's what makes them so fabulous. I don't know if that has come through. You've changed slightly because of the climate change and the environment, and it's that. I just wondered if that was a kind of a hint, or was just a natural thing that's kind of coming through a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, what you're describing is something slightly unsettling.
Yes,
is the word I would use. I think I can absolutely guarantee you it's not really conscious.
No.
In the sense that, but I do think that those kinds of sentiments can possibly emerge because my view of the world is still changing. I mean, it's not that 40 years ago when I was a student, I was unaware of what was happening in global ecosystems, because I've ever since I was a teenager, I've been interested in those themes. But I think I was probably less anxious, let's say, about the future as I am now. In the intervening years, I had periods when the main pressure was to make a living, put food on the table, young family and all that. And as time has gone by and kids have left home and so on, so my focus has returned to what's my work really about? What's it for? And I think that understanding that I have to reflect the reality of our predicament possibly does come through in that way as you describe it.
I think there's also a transitory thing, isn't there, about the physical geography of places, and some is affected by us, some is affected by itself, in terms of erosion, in terms of the wearing away of coastlines, etc. is just the fact that water will not stop doing that. We may be affecting bits of that more or less in certain areas because of our actions, but that's the other thing I think kind of ties into all that. But Tim, let's carry on, because we've got a couple more images to get through. Yes. And everyone, thank you for watching along. I hope you're pulling lots of bits out of this, because I'm glad, Joe, that we've got a couple of woodland or treescape, whatever you want to call it. We've got a couple of different types of images here to kind of finish on. But for me, I mentioned earlier that I wanted to kind of refer to the seeing figures, shall we say, and the first thing I did was feel that with our figures here in the front. I see a sort of elongated person, prone, shall we say, but again, I don't want to force that onto anybody or anything, but you have a particular relationship with trees, and a lot of photographers do, and that's something that I think is quite special, isn't it, to then work with them. It is a partnership, isn't it, in the creation of these images?
Well, yeah, definitely. I think a love of trees is for me, it's partly a kind of introvert thing, because I always felt a feeling of being comforted being in the woods, actually, with the trees around you. There's something kind of, some woods can be quite haunting as well, but I love being surrounded by trees. And so, my relationship with trees goes back to childhood. But as time has gone by, you develop your kind of intellectual, scientific curiosity for everything around you in the world. Then so other realizations come about. And I remember doing some work in Cornwall about 25 years ago, I think it was, for the National Trust, and talking to one of the land managers who explained to me how that he felt bad that for years the National Trust had tidied up all their woodland, to make it safe and look nice for humans, because they realized that actually you needed litter on the ground. I mean, essentially trees should, what he was saying was clearly, if tree falls across a path, we've got to clear it. but actually increasingly now, this was 25 years ago, you know, we are leaving trees where they're fallen, because as they break down, they contribute in very important ways to the health of the woodland environment. And so, you know, he's right about that. And as time has gone by, I've done more background reading, you get to realize that, you know, natural ecosystems absolutely depend on dead things, you know, dead and dying environments. And that a 500-year-old tree, there's a famous saying that a tree, an oak tree, grows for 500 years, it lives for another 500 years, it dies for 500 years. You know, and that's not exactly true, but the cycles of a tree's life, of a great tree, you know, a very long-lived species like an oak or a sequoia or a bristlecone pine, are profound. I mean, they live for so long, but not only that, they form the kind of biological basis for generations that follow them, by providing ecosystems for insects and small animals that help to enrich and stabilize and provide the background resilience for all ecosystems, especially in the maritime zones and the you know, temperate zones with which we're familiar. So I've made a very specific goal of trying to photograph fallen trees. And it just so happens that this is my current favorite among those. So I've put a lot of work into bringing this picture to life in the way that I would say it, you know, in a way that I think is a metaphor for the life that trees have after they've died. You know, and that's the objective with the picture. I mean, I don't want to labor that point, because ultimately, you know, you can only, as an eyewitness photographer, I'm limited by the image as I, you know, the opportunities of where I can put the camera, you know, forward, backwards a little bit, up a bit, left a bit, framing and so on. All of those things. Those are the only controls I have. But hopefully, within that, I can convey a feeling, at least to myself, of the rhythm, to use that word again, shape, the textures and colors, everything, all the visual relationships that we have at our disposal to you know, to frame and to then to work on a little bit in editing, to bring that idea, the idea that dead trees also live. That's the objective of this picture at any rate. And everything, I've printed it too, by the way, Tim, you'll be pleased to know, so that you know, that everything I've done here has been about that. And actually it is about bringing it to print, because to me that's when it really comes back to life, when all pictures come back to life.
Joe, can I just ask a little bit off piece, but I think it's pertinent perhaps to what you were just talking about, in that you've been specifically going out, or being mindful of, when you're out and about, you know, searching for these fallen trees, and with that idea and concept in mind, in terms of maybe how you might then present that work. Obviously you have your gallery, and there's a wide variety of your work, and you do a great job of promoting other people's work in there as well, which is great. But I wonder whether this is something that actually might need to live with other images of a similar type. And I suppose my real question is, do you feel there are times where bodies of work with that sort of ongoing theme can maybe you know, alert the viewer to the fact you're going to take them a bit more overtly into that conversation, as opposed to this image sitting on a wall amongst other types of images? Do you know what I mean?
I do, and in fact, it's a very canny question, because I'm actually working on a series of these. So for that very reason, and if you think about other art forms, again, you know, typically a poet produces you know, a book of verse, often with related or complementary themes. a musician or a band produces an album, and so often different types of artwork do help. It does help if you have groups, because it extends the story, or it provides a kind of a reinforcement, emphasis. It's not just a one-off. I mean, it's difficult because this, frankly, I think I love this picture, and I really do think that it's very strong. And it's one I'm really, really proud of. But it does, it does look like a one-off unless it's given some support. So yes, I'm continuing to work. I'd love to be able to find something again, that. Well, as you perhaps you'll see, I've got an exhibition coming up next summer 22, hopefully, which will include this picture, and I'll send you an invite, Sam.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's almost just finding those echoes, isn't it, of kind of in the sequence as well going forward, I suppose.
I think if you can, I mean, each image is different, isn't it? Just like a song, each song, on an album is different, but you'll find some repeating themes. And, I think that's as photographers, as artists, you're trying to, you deal with one thing at a time. As a photographer, you have to focus completely on trying to solve the problem as best you possibly can. But what you're attracted to and why you photograph is part of your bigger picture, your internal picture of the world around you, and maybe ideas and impressions you want to convey. I mean, if you're a photojournalist covering a war, you'll very definitely have a specific agenda, and you might not want to be taking sides, but you probably will be, whether you like it or not. And the messages conveyed will be through that filter, and I've definitely got an agenda.
Okay, let's get to the last image, Joe. I really appreciate you giving us so much time, because it's great to get into these themes and topics in a bit more detail, and obviously the actual images in more detail as well. And I think I just want to let you talk about this, but we've touched on many things to do with the visual side of things in terms of managed order, so to speak. And I think you're someone who has been able to find that even in broader views, and even in very chaotic and very busy views. And there's a real skill to anybody finding that visual order, because we do have to connect with an image, don't we, as a viewer? There has to be some sort of visual order. That can often be chaotic order, but it's still order. And the conscious decision of the photographer and the movements they've made and the placing they've done of all the elements obviously influences that. And here we have this very striking sort of graphical V for me in the center of the frame. But I know there's many other sort of co-stars supporting that. But maybe if you can expand a bit on that idea, Joe, of that kind of ordered chaos, and some of the challenges and joy you have being in these situations with wrangling with those things successfully.
Yeah, wrangling's a very good way of putting it, because it is like that. If I look back through the sequence of files, and on this particular morning, and this is the only frame of this, and it's a reminder of how quickly everything was changing. As the sun was rising and the mist was starting to dissolve. So I only literally have one frame where all these elements came together in this way. I had other pictures that I really like as well from that morning, but this one is my favorite. And it did require editing to sort of probably establish that sense of order, as you put it, Sam, in the chaos. Clearly, it is very, very chaotic. It's shot with a long lens, by the way, on a technical camera, a 150, which is like a 100 on a 35mm full frame camera. So it's not super long, but it allowed that little bit of isolation and focus on that particular yeah, it is that one. It's that one tree with the kind of gesturing V shape, uplifting branches, which is then echoed slightly by the tree on the left, which also has a similarly angled branch. And it's often very subtle little things like that that help to kind of create that rhythm and pattern. And then what I had to do to as it were build the light is there's a little bit of work done to lift the mist. I mean, if you think of this, the contrast is enormous, as you can see. I mean, the background sky is pretty much 100% white. I mean, it is, and I can't remember now whether I need it. I think it probably is white, but I think it's sufficiently soft because of the mist. The transitions are not harsh, and it's actually that's the key. The fact that might be, you know, in RGB terms 256, 256, 256 doesn't matter so long as, for me at least, it might matter to an RPS distinctions panel who would get rid of it because it would would fail on the grounds of being burnt out or clipped. But if the transitions into the trees which are being dissolved by mist beyond is sufficiently soft, then it's coherent visually to me. So it's about the language, you know, the visual language. And where I've had to do a little bit of additional work, apart from the timing of, you know, making the picture at that moment, is in actually softening the trees in the background a little bit. So I had to lighten them, lift the blacks a little bit. And that's done with a brush, carefully, selectively, so in a way that hopefully you can't see it. I mean, that's, for me, the key to being, to being satisfied with my work is I don't want to see the joins. I don't want to be able to see the process. It should look just right, which is particularly difficult with this image for all sorts of reasons. The colors are extremely unusual, but that, you know, you think, I look at it now and think, well, the tree's really that grey. But if you go back to the raw file, that's what they look like. You know, which in itself is pretty weird. But I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that it was actually blue sky with this low-lying mist, and so the ambient light is actually really cold. So when there's no direct sunlight on the trees, and they're all backlit here, all of the kind of organic colours are kind of subdued, and they do appear almost grey, depending on where you set the white balance of the raw file. So, you know, that's about as natural as I could get it to look, frankly.
Joe, just can we talk a little bit about the printing and the paper? Because I know you were very much involved in the platinum cotton, the 305 creation. So maybe if you could just maybe expand a little bit on why, because there's various elements of that which I know were important to you from an archival and a production point of view. So maybe you could expand on that and why that is your paper of choice to kind of realize that aesthetic out into the print.
Yeah, sure thing, Sam. I'll try anyway. I mean, there are kind of three main elements to it. Firstly, matte paper or glossy paper. So, you know, because as Tim will tell us, you know, glossy papers are a lot easier to print on generally. You don't, you know, to worry usually about soft proofing and stuff. And they do have more dynamic range, which means that for many people, they are an attractive option. However, I love matte paper because I hate reflections. So it's simple as that, really. I don't like. Why don't I like reflections? I mean, all glossy papers reflect light off the sheen of the surface, and while it can be, you know, doesn't matter for every kind of photograph, but it means that you're always subliminally aware of the surface. Whereas a matte paper, you can more easily lose the surface and just kind of be completely absorbed by the image itself. So that's the first thing. So I'm in favour of matte papers if you can make a good print on them. They have to be very, very high quality to get the dynamic range. So that's you know, smooth cotton 300, which I used for several years, is certainly one of those. But then the next thing is smooth or textured. And although I like textured papers, my colleagues at the gallery particularly always used to encourage me to go for smooth papers, because they then don't get complaints from their customers. Those textured papers sometimes, in certain kinds of lighting situations, imagine a very angled spotlight on a textured paper where a print may have been hung in somebody's sitting room. You get these little micro shadows that can be a bit disturbing. So that's a problem with textured paper. So I've generally opted for smooth papers for exhibition printing. I love textured papers for prints that you can hold in a hand. They can be really, really nice though. So for portfolio prints and so on. And then having sort of settled on smooth matte, and had lots of conversations with Toby, particularly at Fotospeed, early doors. So several years ago now. And that's what I settled on. I thoroughly enjoyed using it, but then had a bit of a revelation about 5 years ago, when it might have been more than that, when Charlie Kramer came over and to talk at a conference, and we were discussing paper types, and he had a little UV torch, and he was able to show me that although I thought there were either no or very few OVAs in smooth cotton, it turns out there were some OVAs in smooth cotton, as revealed by Charlie's UV torch. So I remember getting back to Toby and saying, look, I'd really like to try a paper with no OVAs in it. And at that time, Fotospeed didn't have an OVA-free matte, smooth matte paper of their own brand. So we agreed to work on it together, and that, or at least, I didn't physically do anything, but I just kept encouraging them, Fotospeed, to keep developing. And I'm really, it was really thrilling when Platinum Cotton came out, and it proved even better than I hoped. And so, why do you want to avoid OVAs? This is the last of the 3 points, by the way. It's just that OVAs, they give you that very, very white finish, which it's obviously good in lots of ways, and it does help a little bit with dynamic range technically. However, it is from it's suboptimal from an archival point of view, essentially, because OVAs will deteriorate over time. That's just their nature, and as they do so, the print itself will change color. It may not change very much. I don't really know. I've not done a big study on it, but the authorities in the kind of conservation ecosystem say that really for optimum archival printing, it's better to be on a paper that doesn't use OVA. So, maybe I'm being too optimistic that anybody would want to keep my work, but hopefully they might.
Well, it evaporates, doesn't it? The OVAs, which are optical brightness agents, so they will evaporate over time, and it becomes slightly a warmer paper over time, doesn't it? So the actual prints can change, and they can just change very slightly. It's the same with other papers as well. Like if you collect old newspapers or something, they'll start to yellow over time and things like that.
Yeah.
It's slightly different, but kind of the same kind of theory behind it. But yeah, so from an archival point of view, and also from an environmental point of view, isn't it, Joe? Because these OVAs are effectively chemicals, aren't they? Effectively going into these things. So so archival prints is the OVA free is the way to go, definitely.
Well, I hope Platinum Cotton 305 is doing well with the sales, Tim.
Even
Definitely.
more so after today, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
No, but if you have any technical questions out there, people, about the paper or the paper types or what makes them up or why, then obviously Tim and all the Fotospeed team are more than happy to help. And that is a big resource. It's just a faceless place or a faceless internet site. There's experts that are working alongside expert photographers to kind of push that forward and make sure everybody gets the best quality product in the safest way and in the most useful way as well. So do let us know if you have any queries on that in the videos or directly to Fotospeed. But Joe, listen, I will bring us to a close because you've given us way more time than I said, which always happens. But it's always a pleasure, and you know it always happens. But it's always a pleasure to talk to you, because I think if I can just kind of finish on one point, I think everything important about photography is supported by the how, but it's taken forward by the why. And I think we've talked about some of those important topics, and you've talked about how understanding that for yourself has become a major motivator again, and it can be obfuscated behind commercial requirements for all of us. But I think just understanding our why whenever we head out with the camera, hopefully, is a good thing to take forward from everyone if they possibly can. But it's a pleasure seeing your images and talking to you. So thank you very much for all your time.
Thank you, Sam.
Oh, thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Tim.